When does a parody stray so far from its target that the joke is entirely lost? Usually when parodies and stereotypes show up in the media, we recognize them for what they are and so we know not to take them seriously. But every once in a while, an example of parody or exaggeration will become the standard for how its subject matter is seen. One such subject is a group that's been consistently dealing with this for over 4 decades. The Goth subculture. We are going to examine its history with a focus on the increasingly strange challenges it faced, and every consequence that led to Goth getting haunted by a PR nightmare while losing control of its own story.
He is being described as being involved with the Goth movement, but what exactly is that? We kind of know it when we see it, but some aspects of a Goth lifestyle could they provoke such a murder?
Before I explain how the Goth subculture wound up in the uniquely bizarre mess that it's currently in, I have to elaborate on what Goth is. Just to be clear right off the bat, my objective is not to judge or disparage other subcultures or genres of music. Learning the exact definition of Goth as well as its history has become enough of a confusing mess that the real answers need to be immediately pointed out. Otherwise, it's harder to follow along with our story. As of the making of this video, the definition of Goth has been the subject of debate in a weirdly specific way that other music subcultures haven't had quite the same problems with. While the punk and metal subcultures are all but universally agreed to be rooted in music, the general public interprets Goth as an adjective for spooky visuals, societal outcasts, and edgy things in general, especially if teenage girls like it. This is despite Goth being just as much of a music-based subculture as punk or metal. So perhaps now you might be asking to yourself, well then, what makes Goth its own genre? Goth rock, the standard sound of the Goth genre, is most often recognized by the following. Prominent bass lines with a gloomy atmosphere, distorted, often flanged and melodic guitars, and intense, either mechanical or tribal-sounding drum beats. One very consistent audio quality heard across all subgenres of Goth is the heavy presence of reverb. Every subgenre of Goth, from dark wave all the way to death rock, has some version of the resulting sound blended in with other elements to create a recognizably Goth but still unique sound of its own.
But those days are gone. Shadows held it up. I never knew why. What's to follow in the days to go? December's tragic drive. When time is poetry. A single moment was enough to create this. A retinal distraction when a scatter of light hits and forms an image. Am I too lost to be saved? Am I too lost? My God, my tourniquet. I won't answer you back. It's the dance that will never feel. And the alarms that you can't do. Diving for the cannonball into the bottom of the genic pool. 'Cause we can't stop killing and we'll never stop killing, and you shouldn't stop killing your ring. The busting of death consumed me completely. This memory is still within me. Left with no regrets for life itself.
The Goth subculture has existed since the late 1970s, created as an offshoot of the punk and glam rock subcultures of the time. Initially, it was called positive punk, but thanks to critics describing the music of Joy Division, Susie and the Banshees, and Bauhaus as goth, the genre instead eventually became known as goth rock. At the time, the name was more widely understood as a genre of music, separate from Germanic tribes, classic literature, or a style of architecture. A fun way to remember it is that Susie and the Banshees aren't called Susie and the Flying Buttresses. Dedicated fans of the genre have since been called goths, just like how people who primarily listen to metal are called metalheads, and people who primarily listen to punk are called punks. This simple fact has caused a number of strange arguments to the contrary, and yet these arguments never hold any weight. Most of them come from other usages of the word gothic. Goth and gothic are not the same thing. Stating that they are would be like being asked to show your ID to buy root beer because the word beer implies alcohol. The word gothic appears in many different places, often appearing in entirely separate musical context from goth rock. A common misconception is that gothic metal falls into the goth genre. However, despite the name, it's a subgenre of metal that can sound very different from goth. While some gothic metal can contain elements of goth music, that doesn't make it goth any more than rock can be considered the blues because of the direct influence. There's also the case of Ray Gun Gothic, the formal name for the 1950s brand of retrofuturism. Thankfully, nobody has been far gone enough yet to call the Jetsons a goth TV show. Something many don't realize is that the goth genre is incredibly diverse to the point where a surprising amount of people like it without realizing what it is. Now is a good time to bring up that goth is by no means restricted by race, religion, or age. None of those things can or should affect someone's taste in music. And by the standards of the goth subculture, primarily liking the music is the one requirement to being considered a goth. As the goth subculture slowly began to take shape and figure out an identity in the late 1970s and early 1980s, extreme religious conservatives were convinced that everything from recent crimes to anything, and I mean anything, involving supernatural fiction were all part of a demonic global conspiracy to lead everyone to eternal hellfire. This mass hysteria would become known as the Satanic Panic. This is the origin of the stereotype that goths are devil worshippers. Outside of that, the 1970s and 80s were a perfect time for goth to quietly grow, since flamboyant rockers and new wave music were popular. This meant that goth was a unique alternative to the norm without being too much of a stretch from what people were used to at the time. Like any music genre that gets big enough, goth would slowly develop a visual aspect. The now iconic goth fashion has since become visually distinct from the fashion of other music-based subcultures. While the differences are difficult to tell to an untrained eye, they become easier to spot when you get to know them. The Satanic Panic was actively reported in the news until the early to mid-1990s, at which point goth's popularity had already skyrocketed. And by that point, the public's reaction to goth went from, "Oh my goodness, Billy has been possessed by the devil," to, "Billy, I care far too much about what other people think to let you express yourself."
Hello and welcome to Goth Talk.
And we're getting this awful reputation. We hate Marilyn Manson. We don't like him, and people think we do.
By the 1990s, the goth subculture had blown up in popularity, with its nightclubs and concerts having more of a presence than ever before. Goth music, fashion, and the community itself were naturally evolving in many new creative directions. The success of goth-inspired movies including The Crow, Batman Returns, and The Craft helped it gain even further traction. The subculture was thriving to the point where many goths look back on this era with particular fondness. However, certain media outlets were determined to make goth into something that society should fear. Because of this being timed alongside the Satanic Panic, goths have since dealt with being ludicrously stereotyped as vampires, cultists, witches, sexual deviants, generally unstable, and so on. With an almost comedic sense of timing, nu metal entered the mainstream and made the ability to recognize goth more confusing for the average Joe. With only vague context and the aforementioned stereotypes for outsiders to go off of, artists like Marilyn Manson, Slipknot, and Korn were immediately misinterpreted en masse as being goth. Introducing the masses to their own takes on dark music and all-black fashion, Marilyn Manson in particular capitalized on the confusion of people from the outside looking in. This was easy for him since he branded himself in such a way that the general public can't tell the difference between his version of shock rock and a surface-level understanding of goth. Manson's opportunism popularized the misconception that goth and metal are interchangeable words amongst a lot of other things. As a result, the vast majority of goths everywhere have since found Manson and his antics rather unpleasant. This also resulted in a wave of confused teenagers who mistook nu metal for goth, and they would refuse to be told otherwise because they wanted in on the shock value that was now associated with it. Due to their tendencies to hang out in gatherings at shopping malls, people within the goth subculture would take to calling them mall goths as a way to differentiate them. It should be noted that ironically, the mall goths had enough of their own unique thing going for them that they could have just ran with a new name and made it as their own separate subculture. Whatever potential they had at the time was wasted, and the simple refusal to take a unique name kept the group from surviving past the 2000s due largely to what happened next. For a good while, the fear-mongering and misdirection weren't working, until April of 1999, when tragedy struck. Two teenagers named Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold shot up their high school in Columbine, Colorado. This was the first major school shooting in American history, and people were desperate for answers as to why. Media talking heads everywhere now had a national tragedy to pin on everything they hated, from video games to Marilyn Manson to goth. The goth connection in particular was something that the surviving students of Columbine actively tried to dispel, only for the media to ignore the very people that they claimed to sympathize with. This was a serious mishandling by the media, which only served to make an already traumatic event into an excuse for a witch hunt. In just one day, goths, gamers, and oddballs in general were deemed a socially acceptable target for vile behavior from those around them. This is the moment when goth was forced underground, the mainstream media presuming it would die off. And by their logic, if something was dead, its image could be molded into anything you wanted it to be. When the 2000s arrived, the mainstream media saw goth as a dying trend that deserved mockery. Mall goths and their shenanigans were the only way to portray goth as far as the mainstream could care. Unfortunately, they were given the spotlight for long enough to do some damage by laying the groundwork for stereotyping goths in increasingly embarrassing ways. This immediately took effect in the animation industry.
Geez, it's hot. Aren't you sweating, Sam?
Regular people sweat. Goths, we simmer.
It's hard to find an animated character from that point in time that caused as much long-term confusion about goths as Sam Manson from Danny Phantom. Over the years, she's become the unofficial face of goth misrepresentation. Her character can best be described as a whiny, self-righteous hypocrite who says and does cartoonishly edgy things. She's a sidekick whose entire purpose is to end up with the protagonist. Now, in any other case, this character wouldn't even be worth mentioning. Or at least she wouldn't be if she hadn't gone on to popularize the idea of objectifying goths as a trophy, which ironically enough the character herself would hate. It would have been no harm, no foul if she were just another wacky cartoon character who the audience understood was an exaggeration. Instead, she was their introduction to the concept. So, you might be asking, what characters on TV actually represented goth well at that point in time? Guys, it's the goth kids from South Park. I can't believe I'm saying this, but good luck finding a better example.
Well, I think we all know what has to be done.
Yup. Let's get to it.
Hey, what the hell are you doing?
We should probably get out of here.
So, the characters of the goth kids in South Park can best be described as a group of whiny, self-righteous hypocrites who say and do cartoonishly edgy things. Now wait just a minute, you might say. That's how you described Sam Manson not even a minute ago. Well, yes it is, except there's a difference. For starters, they act as a close-hitting satire of the goth community's more pretentious members. They're inherently obnoxious characters like Sam is, except in this case that's very obviously the point. They're like a goth equivalent of what the Eltingville Club is for geeks. We're clearly not supposed to idolize these kids or take their absurdities at face value. We're just supposed to laugh at their antics. Maybe it's not that surprising that this show would know how to portray goths, considering that one episode featured Robert Smith of The Cure in a surprisingly wholesome cameo.
Wow, Robert Smith is the greatest person that ever lived.
Our savior.
Can I have my walkie-talkie back now, please?
No way! You gave it to us. It's mine now.
All right, I'll Rochambeau you for it. Ready?
Huh?
Hey, where's he going?
Goodbye, Robert Smith. Thank you for your help. Visit us again. Disintegration is the best album ever!
As insane as it feels to say that South Park, of all things, has one of the most accurate and celebrated portrayals of any group in a TV show, let alone in pop culture overall, it's a necessary thing to point out when demonstrating how severe Goth's PR problem is. It should also be noted that around this time, the Scooby-Doo franchise introduced a group of characters called the Hex Girls. Within their first appearance, they immediately made a point of having them call themselves a goth rock band, or more specifically, eco-goth.
Witches? We just pretend that stuff. It's just a gimmick for our band. We're eco-goths.
Seriously, what the hell is that? And yet, for some bizarre reason, they play this generic rock that sounds nothing like any variation of goth.
You'll wake up in the dead of night, missing me when I'm outside. I'm a hex girl. I'm gonna put a spell on you. I'm a hex girl, and I'm gonna put a spell on you.
Unfortunately, most creators who have been in charge of bringing goth characters to life in any medium haven't been bothering to do their research.
We decided to make her gothy because back when Danny Phantom was created, goths were very big. They were all over the place. They were sort of the hipster of the early 2000s.
When something that's known for mocking everything can make a better representation of a group than you can, that's when you know you've dropped the ball on character creation.
But every year, thousands of unwanted goths and emos end up bothering the rest of us with their stupid outfits and sad-sack personalities. Help control the goth population by having your goths spayed or neutered today.
In real life, goths in a post-Columbine world were continuing to face increasing hostility. One horrific tragedy in 2007 showcased this all too well. On a fateful night in Lancashire, a goth couple named Robert Maltby and Sophie Lancaster were walking home when they were spotted by a group of 5 boys who didn't like the way they were dressed. The two were followed and brutally attacked, barely surviving the encounter as their bodies were mercilessly stomped on. Robert went on to recover from his injuries, but Sophie had to be taken off of life support 13 days later. She was only 20 years of age. The Lancaster family set up a charity in her name dedicated to fighting prejudice and intolerance towards people from alternative subcultures. Robert Maltby has since moved on with his life and wishes to be remembered as an artist rather than one of the victims of that attack. Only 2 of the attackers were given long sentences for Sophie's murder. The others were given between 4 years and 4 months to 5 years and 10 months for the attack on Robert. Despite common misconceptions, goths don't collectively hate life or have a death wish. While the goth subculture was facing the impact of what had become a major problem with public optics, another subculture didn't have it any easier. Throughout the 2000s, the emo subculture had reached the height of its popularity and wound up with its own public perception problem as well. Since the general public was quick to conflate goth with emo, the problems for one started to affect the other.
Hi, my name is Ebony Darkness Dementia Ravenway. I'm not related to Gerard Way, but I wish I was, because he's a major fucking hottie. I am a vampire, but my teeth are white and straight, and I have pale white skin. I'm also a witch, and I go to a magic school called Hogwarts in England, where I'm a 7th year. I'm a goth.
In case you couldn't tell.
I wear mostly black. I love Hot Topic, and I buy all my clothes from there. I was walking outside Hogwarts. It was snowing and raining, so there was no sun, which I was very happy about. A lot of press stared at me, and I put my middle finger up at them.
It should be noted that the media chose not to sensationalize this shocking murder committed by an emo teenager named Alyssa Bustamante, despite continuing to shame goths for a misplaced connection to the Columbine shooting. This, of course, didn't stop goths and emos alike from dealing with relentless mockery in both real life and in the media. While goths were still dealing with the blame for Columbine, the emos being spared collective blame over Bustamante's actions shows that perhaps the media can potentially learn from its mistakes. Goths were now dealing with many new obstacles from the outside that were enough of a handful on their own. At the same time, they were also dealing with another problem that nobody could have predicted. The trouble began when groups of ravers all over the world had their sights set on a specific direction: goth nightclubs. While there's nothing wrong with people trying new things, these new attendees had no interest in what they were walking into, aside from certain industrial and synth-pop artists whose music was played there. It wasn't difficult for the ravers to outnumber the goths after Columbine, and the venues, as well as many in the industrial community, embraced this new audience in a bid to survive. This new group quickly adopted the name cybergoth. They developed a distinct style of futuristic outfits and doing what I can only describe as borderline kung fu as a form of dancing. They immediately became an object of animosity from plenty of goths and fans of cyberpunk. Goths wanted their spaces back, and despite the name, cybergoth has no real crossover with goth or cyberpunk. The cybergoth trend mostly dwindled out around the beginning of the 2010s, taking many beloved goth venues with it. While groups of cybergoths do still exist, some are noticeably friendlier and safer to get involved with than others. By the early 2010s, goth was almost entirely underground. The influx of new bands and community members was incredibly dry, and the mainstream had mostly forgotten about it. Goth had become an even more niche interest than ever before, until something unexpected happened. Goth started getting a new surge of life. With a resurgence of old artists coming back and new ones picking up where others left off, goth saw a major revival midway through the decade. But we can't discuss goth in the 2010s without pointing out that things didn't go smoothly at all. The resurgence of goth came with a catch. Seemingly out of nowhere, the mainstream wanted to make it trendy. It started out, harmlessly enough, with misnamed fashion trends from Tumblr such as pastel goth, health goth, and eventually new goth when the third season of American Horror Story came out. These trends picked up a decent amount of attention, and it was ultimately people outside of goth who ran with them for a little while. New goth in particular is easily the most interesting of the bunch since it took the longest to fade out and sounds like it would have some kind of musical substance like new metal does. In reality, it was nothing more than a fashion trend that visually harkened back to the misconceptions of goths from the Satanic Panic. This brings us to how internet content creators have played a major role in the direction that goth has been going in, and how incredibly wrong things have gone from there. A massive elephant in the room when discussing the tensions between goth and the internet is the effect that decades of goth's barely addressed PR problem has had on Generation Z. The track called "E-Girls Are Ruining My Life" by Corpse Husband is a perfect example of gas being poured on that fire. The popular track's lyrics equating the goth subculture with the E-Kid trend have been yet another source of confusion over what goth is. Now, for the sake of being fair, it's important to remember that this isn't the first time since Mallgoth that a new group's label has been initially rejected by its intended adherents in favor of an unrelated one. While it's thankfully becoming much less common for them to feel this way now, many who would have otherwise fit the label of emo during the height of its pop culture presence felt embarrassed or insulted by being called emo due to the way that word was negatively thrown around, and in some cases wanted to be associated with a different label. While some of those people wound up using the scene label, others would often mislabel themselves as goth, which resulted in unrelated bands like My Chemical Romance and Evanescence being mistaken for goth music by outsiders as well as newcomers. Today's E-Kids have been doing something very similar to yesterday's emos, right down to mislabeling the musicians they listen to as goth. Many of today's E-Kids have shown a tendency to want the goth label for themselves, despite having no interest in the subculture attached to it. Outside of certain elements of goth fashion, E-Kids have mostly shown interest in playing into many of the negative stereotypes that have been associated with goth over the years. It eventually got to the point where some of them started romanticizing and even calling themselves Mallgoths. This is more than a tad ironic, since not only did the original Mallgoths not identify with that name, these new Mallgoths are commonly found in online spaces rather than in shopping malls. But interestingly, as of this recording, this has put E-Kids in a position where if they wanted to, they could successfully help the goth subculture by redeeming and even retroactively rebranding Mallgoth, fully embracing the controversial legacy that they really wanted in the first place. While people should be free to express themselves the way they want to, it's frustrating when the way they go about it gets in the way of how unrelated groups are treated. The goth community's presence on the internet isn't sparse. For example, there are a number of great YouTube channels that discuss and showcase goth in various unique ways, so it's not for lack of trying that the goth subculture is struggling to use the platform to solve its dilemma. The problem is simple. It's hard to get through to people when there are content creators using all kinds of greasy and underhanded methods to sell a more marketable lie. A goth on the internet telling the truth will often be ignored by a newcomer when someone with ulterior motives pops up and tells them that anyone who tries to draw lines in the sand, regardless of whether or not they're polite about it, is a gatekeeping elitist. As odd as it is, this bold-faced lie works on newcomers like a charm no matter how much bad behavior these grifters get caught with. Examples include, but are far from limited to, passive-aggressively calling audience members bigots instead of accepting constructive criticism, trivializing sexual assault, and trying to play victim after being called out as an abuser. But for the sake of a fair, nuanced perspective, I'm going to let this guy speak for himself and tell you exactly what goth means to him.
I don't know, I wish I could create a new word for what I am. Because I kind of hate goth, you know? I hate everyone. A lot of people that are in it are just dicks, and they're really exclusive and elitist, and I'm tired of it. I'm sick and tired of all these rules and regulations. I just want to wear black, and I just, you know, why? Just stop. Wearing black clothes is cool. There we go. Goth is no longer goth. It's just cool. I wear cool fashion.
As our biggest example just proved, a disturbing amount of these so-called goth influencers are profiting off of lying to their audience. They purposely avoid telling the truth because it would be detrimental to their popularity and profit. All both of vice, venom, and vitriol that results from it are actively undermining the goth community's ability to progress. They don't actually believe their own lies, or practice the kindness they preach. They're knowingly taking advantage of their fans' need for validation. And that's not fucking cool.
Nie gehört. Nie vorher gehört. Hat was mit den Gruftis zu tun, oder? Die Gruftis, genau, ja. Was hältst du denn überhaupt von Gruftis? Die Flirten. Die Gruftis-Szene.
I'm not saying that goth should never be made fun of, nor am I saying that it should never be mocked or misrepresented. That would be arrogant and unrealistic. Despite the low number of them, there are great parodies of goth out there that I highly recommend. Most things should be laughed at here and there because it makes life more fun. This is just a case where the joke went too far. The real-life results of the parody have become more mockable than anything that's been shown in fiction.
Oh my god, is that a goth Tommy, mommy? Hold up, where is she going? And wait, what is she saying? I think I heard her. She said two things. Tell me now! Well, the first thing she said was the TX2 is going on to...
This is what happens when successful action isn't taken before an overused joke becomes the socially accepted truth instead of the real subject. While the goth subculture is doing alright as an especially large niche interest group, one has to wonder how many more people would be able to enjoy it if they knew what it really is instead of just warped caricatures and cartoon stereotypes made by people who don't care enough to understand it. Parody always works better when it comes from a place of at least understanding what you're joking about instead of mocking something for the sake of it. If someone really wants to put a goth character in a project, there's no reason not to try portraying goths accurately. Films like Gypsy 83 demonstrate that legitimate goths can be compelling lead characters in their own right. It's not like we haven't seen successful properties based on music subcultures. Just look at how beloved SLC Punk and Metalocalypse are. On the other side of the coin, people who are obviously posing as goths would be better suited if a creator really wants that familiar flavor of edginess. A great example of this is Sam from Life as a House. Sam's character arc wouldn't be quite as memorable if he didn't start out as an edgy mall goth. It shows that the real, unexaggerated absurdity of a subject can be just as entertaining while getting the same point across. But the creator's point is meaningless if the audience doesn't get it. The word goth has been commonly used in recent years as an adjective for anything from a pop star trying to look edgy to a black cheeseburger. But why all this emphasis on using the word goth to describe an enjoyment of dark and morbid things when goth never had a monopoly on that? There have been plenty of talented people throughout history who have been doing their own spooky thing long before the goth subculture was established and still are well afterwards. Examples including Mary Shelley, Rod Serling, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, Edward Gorey, Junji Ito, Henry Selick, and Guillermo del Toro. If you, dear viewer, are someone who doesn't like goth music but actively calls yourself a goth based on stereotypes for whatever reason, I have a few questions for you. If your motivation is to get into goth, why would you only listen to the perspectives of people who either don't care about it or have something to gain from lying? Why would their perspectives be more valuable than the perspectives of the goth community's members? Because at the end of the day, that's not following an alternative path or even malicious compliance. It's just a far lonelier way of following the exact same leader. And in the words of Angela Benedict, we're not trying to keep you out of the gate, we're trying to hand you the key. As for the goth community, there's no good reason not to start taking bigger steps towards fixing our PR problem by now. The goth subculture has overcome a seemingly endless wave of challenges and adversity for the majority of its existence, all while maintaining a strong presence. It's time to face any remaining overweening obstacles with a healthy sense of assertiveness. The state of things are fine, but why settle when it could be so much better?
The crescent and the